Welcome to the HAYVN Hubcast, a place to learn what business leaders, owners, and professionals are doing to navigate and grow in today's market. Hear from industry experts on everything from marketing, leadership, financing, and more. Brought to you by HAYVN, a co-working space where you can connect, create, and get stuff done.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the HAYVN Hubcast. I'm your host, Nancy Sheed, and today we have the distinguished honor of speaking with Congressman Jim Himes. Welcome, Congressman, or Jim.
Thanks, Nancy. Great to be with you.
For those of you who don't know, Congressman Jim Himes represents the 4th District of Connecticut, which encompasses kind of the southwest corner of Connecticut, right? What it includes?
Yeah, it's basically Fairfield County, southwest corner, Fairfield County minus Danbury and a couple of small towns up there.
Yeah, exactly. So HAYVN sits in your district. You recently came to visit HAYVN, and we're going to talk about that later. You are in your, if I'm getting it correct, 8th term?
Can you believe it? I don't know how it happened, but yes, 8th term.
8th term. And for those of you who don't know, those are 2-year terms. So that means going on 16 plus years. So thanking you for your service. But before you got into this, can you just sort of take us back? And did you wake up saying, I want to be in politics? Or can you give us a little bit of a quick history lesson that got you to where we're sitting now?
Yeah, sure. No, it's sort of an interesting story. So, I mean, from when I was a kid, I was always sort of really interested in policy and foreign policy. And, I was a child of the Cold War, and I caught the very end. I was pretty small, but caught the tail end of the Vietnam War. And so I've always been interested in government policy. And, I'm probably a Democrat because I appreciate that when government does big things well, it can really be transformative, which, of course, isn't to say that government can't do big things really poorly. And that probably had something to do with me getting into politics in 2008. But so, yeah, it was always there. And then what I would tell you is right out of grad school, I have a master's in Latin American studies, which I would counsel is not the most commercially powerful degree one can get. But it's a funny story because I figured, I should really go into business for a while before I get into policy, experience it, understand a little bit about, how business works. And so I wound up at Goldman Sachs, and that's where the master's in Latin American studies comes in because I didn't know a darn thing about banking, literally nothing. But back in 1990, Goldman had won a mandate to privatize the Mexican telephone company, Telmex. And lo and behold, I spoke Spanish. And that was enough to get me in the door and ultimately lead to about a 12-year stint with Goldman. Actually working when the peso crisis of 94 hit. That was just as the high-tech world was getting started. The internet was getting, big. And so I was actually a technology banker working with a lot of venture capital groups and doing IPOs and that sort of thing in the late 90s. So introduced to the, kind of startup world, venture capital world. And then, long story short, eventually I realized that I wanted to get back to those roots as those underlying thoughts that policy was really interesting. And so I took a flyer in 2007 and said, heck, I'm going to lose, but why not run for Congress? What the heck? I really thought I was going to lose, but with Barack Obama at the top of the ticket, the coattails, as they say, I got lucky, and the rest is history.
Well, I appreciate that sort of, whenever we have these conversations, it's typically not a linear route. And you can see the, kind of the bouncing back and forth of the zigzags that bring in and inform where you are. So that is very helpful to sort of see what brings you to that point. And not appreciating your background in venture capital in the late 90s and the 2000s, like the world was a different place. There were lots of bubbles and things going on. So I'm curious how that informs sort of now looking at economy and jobs. We've been through several highs and lows. Coming from a small business perspective, a lot has changed. It's much easier for those of us who want to start small businesses to do so. But yet there's still a lot of frustration and things going on. And whether it's getting funding or it's just sort of figuring out what your next step is. How have you seen things change from that sort of late 90s to now in terms of what's possible and also what, to your point, policy is doing to help or potentially hinder us in the smaller business world?
Yeah, great question. I mean, super big picture, 30,000 feet. I mean, those of us of a certain age, the 90s were really a remarkable period of time, right? This is when there was just massive optimism out there. We're paying down our national debt. Bill Clinton is president. The economy's rocking and rolling. The internet emerges, and so many small businesses are in some way related to or rely on the internet. As you said, one of the main things that makes it easier today to start a small business. And so, just a moment at the 30,000 foot level of immense optimism, right? And then, of course, 9/11 happens on 2001 and kind of brings that moment to a close. And it's been, not easy decades since. But no, I guess I hadn't really thought about it, but I think you're exactly right. Capital markets have democratized in a sense, right? You've got fintech companies out there. You've got peer-to-peer lending. Wall Street and the venture capital world woke up some time ago to the fact that it was a big old boys club, and that you could count on one hand the number of women venture capitalists. By the way, our first lady in Connecticut, Annie Lamont, being sort of one of the original gangsters, as they say. But no, I guess I hadn't really thought about it. But, between the emergence of the internet and online opportunities and a more, let's call it, progressive evolution of the capital markets and venture capital, I think you're right. It's never easy to start a small business, but yeah, probably easier now than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah. And just sort of under the umbrella of HAYVN, who sort of brings together small business, and not only small business, but brings together women entrepreneurs, and just sort of also the sharing in the community, which is very different than it is or was for somebody who came from the corporate. How have you seen things in terms of just thinking about either, the other pillars for HAYVN are sustainability and health and wellness, right? And so those are very important to A, our state, B, our country, C, us as individuals, and also as business owners. What are the things that you're sort of excited about or behind in terms of those two things? We'll first go with sort of sustainability and B Corp and sort of doing the right things, not just saying you're doing the right things.
Yeah. No, that's another, I think, cause for some optimism. I mean, if I look back to the 1990s, sustainability wasn't a thing. You just didn't talk about it. The notion that you would invest in the long term with at least an awareness of some of the particularly climate challenges, but other challenges. We talked a little bit about the absence of women from corporate leadership roles in the venture capital industry. There's definitely been an awakening to how important that is manifesting itself. And so I think that's really neat. And I tend to think about it, look, B Corps and do-gooders and all that stuff, great. That's all really important. It's an important evolution of our values. But where I get super excited is when you think about the business opportunities that are made available, both in the realms of sustainability and health and wellness, right? I mean, I would venture a guess that things like yoga instructors, that was probably not a category of employment back in 1980, right? Maybe, but not nearly the extent to which it is today. Caring for our senior citizens in a healthful way, I think there's probably huge opportunities there. And of course, in sustainability, particularly in a place like Connecticut, where we really should be, evolving to more sustainable energy, whether it's installing electric vehicle charging stations or putting photovoltaics on the roof of somebody's garage. I get really excited about the job categories and businesses that we didn't even conceive of 20 years ago that now are going to get very significant in the face of this evolution towards sustainability.
I love hearing that enthusiasm. And also, I was just sort of thinking through the lens of a certain age as I am. We came up and went into jobs in the 90s, and now I'm thinking about the next generation, and they're coming into jobs now and how different that market looks. To your point, like there are so many other opportunities. It's not just corporate. And there are things that it's almost so overwhelming. And people are starting their own businesses at ages 18, 16, and 20. What advice do you have to those just now starting out? As you said, I feel like we kind of grew up in a bit of a bubble. They haven't necessarily grown up. It might be a different type. What advice are you giving to people who are just starting out in the market or starting out in the workforce?
First, disclaimer, I've never actually started a business. So I'm not exactly the wrong. So I'm perfectly equipped to give people advice, right? Now, I worked in the corporate environment for a long time and stuff, but I do have some life advice that maybe fits the bill. Here's the thing, and this is why HAYVN is so interesting, amongst other reasons. Here in my 6th decade on this planet, I have over time come to really appreciate the absolutely critical value of social capital. Now, that's a fancy phrase, which basically means the friends and professional connections that you have. People who are, young people starting businesses often are, oh, well, I need to raise the financing. I need to, hire employees and stuff. There's no substitute for the networks, the social networks that you're part of. Candidly, probably every professional success I've had along the way in the last, whatever it's been, 37 years of career has been intimately related to my social capital. And again, that's a fancy phrase, which basically means friends and acquaintances, people that respect you, people who are going to recommend you and feel like it's a positive to them to recommend you. So I say that, A, because I think it's underappreciated, and B, because, we've just been, young people in particular, my two daughters are in their early 20s. Young people in particular went through that 2 or 3 years of COVID in what I would argue is a very, very challenging way, where a year and a half or 2 years were spent staring into a screen, not building up those relationships, not having those water cooler conversations, those conversations that you can only have at a business conference over a glass of wine, et cetera. And, now, and I really worry about this, remote working is a thing. And look, I think there's a huge place for remote working. If you've got to write something or whatever, you can't be distracted. But oh my God, the value of the relationships that are formed around the proverbial water cooler just cannot be, I think, overstated.
That lends itself exactly to the social capital piece, and also the, that a network isn't LinkedIn. You know what I mean? And I think they have the opposite effect, where we also think how great it would have been to have LinkedIn. I'm a huge fan, but that's not the only way to have a network, and that applying for jobs and thinking about jobs and doing your research, actually picking up the phone and having meetings and not trying to jump through an algorithm to make your network bigger is, the social part of the capital it's also very personal. And I worry that that's a little bit been lost, as you said, with that next generation. So I love that great life advice. Continuing along, just sort of thinking about what's ahead and what's going on in our world. A couple of questions. One is, we've talked particularly about Connecticut and sort of from the small business lens and your constituents, but also with your work, in intelligence, and you and I spoke earlier about, your advocacy with immigration. What are the things that are keeping you up at night that we need to be thinking about a little closer to home, that isn't just a Washington, D.C. concern, it's a concern for the Connecticut citizens?
Yeah, great question. And, being ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, there's a lot of things that could keep me up at night. I could run through the, parade of horribles, Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, blah, blah, blah. I'll tell you what, though, I worry about two things, really. Number one, does the United States keep its innovative edge? And it sounds like I'm sort of going into Haven land here, but the reason this country is great, we're lucky for a whole bunch of reasons, for natural resources, good education, you name it. But if we start ceding our technological lead on innovation, that's when I really start to worry about the international competition, right? And we haven't. China's a near peer with respect to innovation, but they don't have this robust, chaotic, innovative ecosystem that is just such a huge strategic win for the United States. And of course, maintaining that involves really focusing on education, STEM in particular. We have the best universities on the planet, but I do worry about our pre-secondary education, if you will. Are we educating all Americans for the 21st century? The answer to that question is no. Then I also worry, quite frankly, back to the social capital thing. More than at any point in my lifetime, Americans are at each other's throats. And maybe I feel that intensely in the political realm because that's where it's really big. But, I can't even watch social media or the news these days because demagoguery and fear and anger has really set American against American. And if we don't fix that, I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said he doesn't worry too much about us going down to a foreign enemy. It will be us that does ourselves in. And maybe that's particularly my problem because I live in a political world, but I really do worry about that. Again, if we don't figure out a way to reassert some sense of commonality, in which, by the way, we're all Democrats and Republicans and we argue with each other, but we're fundamentally all Americans and nobody's a traitor and nobody's committing treason.
Right.
If we don't fix that, I think this country's in some trouble.
We could be here for hours on that one. And it is a huge concern. And as you said, finding either, I don't know, words that come to mind, common ground, common sense, some sort of things in common in general to get us away from these very diverse polar opposites. What advice do you have, or what things do you do in your, as a politician, or do you, how can we model what you're doing to sort of bring us back together?
Well, that's a big and deep question. So let me answer it in summary fashion with two things. Number one, we got to remember that there's powerful forces out there that are manipulating us. And they're either manipulating us because they want us to spend that extra 4 minutes on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. And the best way to drive engagement, as we know from the social media platforms, is to tickle that amygdala, to piss somebody off, to make them angry, to make them worried, to make them anxious, And so the big social media platforms have developed the ability to reach inside your brain and make you angry or make you concerned or make you anxious. And we just need to be conscious of that, right? And then secondarily, I always say this in town hall meetings, we'll get the democracy that we deserve, right? And I remind people, and this is not a symmetrical problem. I mean, the rejection of fundamental democratic norms associated with MAGA is very different than the extreme left of the Democratic Party. I'm just going to say that up front. But we just need to all take a deep breath and remember that the things that we're arguing about in this country, the problems that we have relative to Chinese problems around demography, which they cannot solve, relative to, UK's economic problems that is going to be very, very difficult to solve. We need to remember that we're very fortunate as a country to have the problems that we do relative to other countries and just need to sort of act accordingly, right? We have these existential arguments, and Donald Trump is up there saying our country is circling the drain and it's going to be over. No. We're arguing over border and immigration policy. We're arguing over whether the top tax rate should be 39% or 35%. Deep breath, folks. If you're really enraged, it's probably because somebody sees it in their interest for you to be enraged.
Such a good point. And that segues sort of nicely into the sort of next topic. Related topic is, this is an election year. And it's a big election year, and some people are feeling like it's, primaries have already started. In Connecticut, does our voice even matter? Is it worth voting? I personally am a big believer that, back to your point, we live in a country where we have a lot of opportunity, and one of those is a responsibility to vote. What's Connecticut doing? What's your philosophy on that? And something I learned this year is we have a huge number of unaffiliated voters in the state of Connecticut, which isn't a surprise given the profile, but there's some impact on what unaffiliated voters can do this year. So I'm curious sort of where you land on how you look at Connecticut's impact in the bigger voting picture.
Yeah. So, there's one way to look at this and to say that Connecticut's a pretty blue place, right? If Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, he's not going to win Connecticut. So you might say, oh, well, gosh, does my vote matter? Yeah, it matters, right? And first of all, you said it exactly right. I don't really understand the people who have to be cajoled into voting. Hundreds of years of people have sacrificed their lives so that you can vote. It is a responsibility. It's a sacred responsibility. And it just makes me crazy when people are like, oh, why should I vote? You know why? Because you're lucky enough to live in a democracy in the 21st century. There's 3 billion people on the planet who can't say that. So buck up and, undertake your civic responsibility. But, here in Connecticut, too, again, we're fortunate to have the problems that we do in Connecticut, right? Is everything hunky-dory? No, it's not. We're a very high-cost state. Wages, power, everything is expensive in the state of Connecticut. That creates real challenges for people who are trying to start businesses or run businesses. So we always have to keep an eye on that, whether it's cost of electricity or whatever it is. We need to. Why are we such a wonderful place to do business? At its core, two things I would say. Number one, we've got incredible people, right? We've got the smartest, best people on the planet. That has to do with our quality of life. It has to do with our educational institutions. It has to do with our proximity to New York. And we need to maintain that. We need to maintain our system of education. By the way, what problems do we have in Connecticut that in the political argument, it's like, oh, the right says it's all about taxes and regulation, and the left says, the minimum wage should be higher. Baloney. Well, maybe that's all true. I shouldn't say baloney. But you know what? When you talk to business leaders, you talk to people who are trying to start businesses, they say two things. transportation infrastructure, wonderful place to live, but at 5 o'clock, I can't move in Fairfield County, right? And number two, housing, right? If you're growing, if you've got a 20-person shop in Stanford and you need to hire a couple more 28-year-olds, where do they live in a city where, opening bid for a house is $800,000, $900,000? So these are solvable problems, but that is something that we in Connecticut need to continue to focus like a laser on. And by the way, the unaffiliateds, though they don't get to vote in a primary, and that has its whole political implications, they play a really important moderating role. If you're not on one of the two teams, both teams need to appeal to you. And unaffiliated people tend to live in the middle. And so that's a moderating influence on Connecticut politics that I think is really valuable.
And point of reference, you just said, if you're unaffiliated, you cannot vote in the primaries, correct? That's something
correct.
I
one
learned.
Downside.
Okay, that's because I think there's some education going on there. People are like, oh, I'm unaffiliated, so I can do whatever. I'm like, oh, no, not in Connecticut. We have different rules than in some places, right?
Well, it's especially important that, this didn't used to be true. 15 years ago, Connecticut was a very purple state. And for a whole bunch of reasons, it's become a very blue state. But that means that, and you may not want to register as a Democrat if you're a traditional Republican or whatever. But the point is that if in a state where today the fight is largely inside the Democratic Party, you might want to have a voice. You may think that I'm really worried about the far left of the Democratic Party. So register as a Democrat and vote for the moderate in the primary. So, and again, I'm not telling people to do that, but you're absolutely right.
It to me is when you hear somebody say, what's the point? And we didn't even cover local politics as well, right? Like, again, having a voice in local in terms of what affects you eminently is also important. I want to go back to the business owners and thinking about sort of what keeps them up at night in Connecticut. And you recently dropped in to visit HAYVN. I think it was a members' breakfast. So I'd love to hear, A, thanks for the visit, and B, I'd love to hear sort of your impressions about HAYVN and what's going on again at this sort of very grassroots level of business and innovation that looks different than it did 30 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I made the point about increasing numbers of women entrepreneurs, wonderful. And I know HAYVN isn't all women, but it's got that value there. And I think that's so important. We got a long way to go across the boards on making sure that women are equally represented in our startups and venture capital and investment banks and corporations, et cetera, C-suites. And so that was cool to see. And this comes back to what we started talking about. Look, starting a business is brutal, right? I mean, most small businesses go under. Financing is very challenging. Hiring good people is challenging. Dealing with it, all of that is really challenging. But to go right back to where we started this, and this is what I so appreciated about HAYVN, there is no substitute for social capital and network. So I saw it. I saw it over bagels and coffee there. People, oh, here's my problem. Oh, did you ever think about doing this? Those conversations can make the difference. And, I just think that's so critical. That's why the incubator model is so interesting, right? A group of people facing similar threats, sharing each other's best practices and stuff. That I think is people always worry about capital, but that social capital, that ability to draw on networks for solutions, I think is a real strength of HAYVN and a real underappreciated asset.
And I think you mentioned it is, then that's the collaboration versus, I think, a mentality back in the day of you would never think about starting your business next to somebody who's starting a business, right? Like, it's my business. I have to do it. I have to keep everything proprietary. And what's so wonderful there is this is where I am. This is where I'm stuck. Did anybody have any ideas? Or listen, let me tell you what I learned when I did that. And there are very similar companies growing side by side at HAYVN, and it has such a different feel and vibe.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. And thanks so much for your interest in HAYVN. Come back and visit us anytime. If people are interested in touching base with you, Congressman, what's the best way to reach you?
Well, the easiest way to go, we're my official website at himes.house.com. That has a way to contact my office. I'm always happy to sit with constituents. I'm always happy to hear from people who have challenges or whatever on the small business front. And so best thing to do is to either call my office or come onto the website, request a meeting. And, I'm always super happy to meet with people. Thank you.
Well, we'll include all that in the show notes. Thank you again for your time. It was a pleasure to speak with you today. And that's another episode of the HAYVN Hubcast.
Thanks so much, Nancy.
Thanks for listening to the HAYVN Hubcast, a place to learn what business leaders and owners are doing to navigate and grow in today's market. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. HAYVN is a co-working space and virtual community located in the heart of Fairfield County, Connecticut. HAYVN is a hub for business owners and professionals to connect, create, and get stuff done. Find out more about the HAYVN community online at hayvn.com. That's HAYVN.com. HAYVN Hubcast is produced by Sound Advice Strategies.